So if you've ever hiked or camped in bear country, you're probably familiar with some basic bear safety tips. When you go to sleep at night, make sure your food is safely stored out of the reach of any hungry bears that might wander into your campground. If you encounter a bear on the trail, make yourself as big and as imposing as possible, make a lot of noise, and back away slowly. Essentially, we're told that bears are uninterested in humans, and although they're big and fearsome creatures, potentially dangerous creatures, with a little bit of common sense, we can coexist peacefully. Because after all, a bear just wants to be left alone, right? But what if a bear, with all its strength and size, one day decided that humans were now on the menu and became hell-bent on hunting down every human being it could find and eating it? That would be pretty terrifying. Well, tragically for the locals, this is exactly what happened in the winter of 1915 in a remote village in the northern island of Hokkaido here in Japan. Over the span of 6 harrowing days, in what would become Japan's worst bear attack in history, 7 villagers were systematically hunted down and butchered in their own homes by a single, massive, seemingly invincible brown bear with a taste for blood. This incident is known nowadays as the Sankebetsu Bear Incident, named after the village that it happened in, or I believe the region of Hokkaido that it happened in. And it is a pretty grisly story. So if you're not into this sort of thing, I recommend maybe turning this off now. I became familiar with this story after I visited Hokkaido actually several years ago, and I saw a brown bear up there, and I got interested in learning more about them, so I did some research, and lo and behold, I found this incident online. And I'm not really going to cover much more than you can get off the Wikipedia entry about this incident. If you're interested, check that out after the video. But really, I just want this story to be more widely known because it is a truly terrifying and remarkable story that I had never heard about before moving to Japan. And I will just preface this by saying that I mean no disrespect to those who were killed in this incident. I know it's been over 100 years now, but still, obviously this was a very, very tragic event, and there are a lot of people in Japan who probably still honor the fallen, and I don't want to make light of that in any way. But the story is also really crazy, so I do want to embellish it with some of my own opinions and ideas about it, and some of my own experiences as well. So I think it's important to start off first with a little bit of background about Hokkaido as an island or region of Japan, and also about brown bears, specifically the Ussuri brown bear. Nowadays, we consider Hokkaido to be an integral part of Japan. It's one of the 4 major islands of Japan, and it's known for its skiing, its seafood, its dairy products, its beer, Sapporo beer, to be precise. But it wasn't always that way. And even to a certain extent today, it's regarded as a bit of a frontier zone. But when you think about the history of Japan with all its samurai and competing warlords and castles and all of this stuff, you have to remember that none of that took place in Hokkaido, or almost none of it. It wasn't until probably the late 1800s that Hokkaido was even really put on the map as a part of Japan. And even then, it wasn't really until the early 1900s, around the time that this story takes place, that Hokkaido as an island saw an influx of Japanese settlers from the mainland. Now, don't get me wrong, they knew it existed as a place. It's just that it never really played a central role in the history of Japan until they decided to occupy it in response to a perceived threat from outside powers, namely Russia, in the late 1800s. If you know anything about the Russo-Japanese War, that was the culmination of these tensions that had been building for several decades. But essentially, the Japanese started colonizing the island and considering it one of the main islands of Japan as sort of a buffer zone against these other powers who would otherwise, at least they thought at the time, would take over the island if the Japanese didn't take it over themselves. Needless to say, Hokkaido was a very wild place at the time, and it still is. If you go there today, there are huge swaths of land devoted to national parks, and there are volcanoes, lots of wildlife. If you love hiking, camping, trekking, skiing, any of that outdoor stuff, you'll really love Hokkaido. And one thing that really surprised me when I visited there was, number one, the fact that they have a different type of bear there that only lives there and on none of the other islands of Japan. Actually, interesting fact, there was a separate species of wolf that lived on Hokkaido as well that didn't live on the mainland of Japan. So despite its proximity, like ecologically, it's quite different from the rest of Japan. So anyways, there's a different type of bear. That's one thing. On the mainland of Japan, they have smaller black bears, but on Hokkaido, they have what's known as the Ussuri brown bear. And it's a subspecies of the Eurasian brown bear, from what I understand. But they grow massive, and that was the second most surprising thing for me, was just how big they were. I was able to glimpse a couple of them briefly when I was on this one peninsula called Shiratoko, which is where most of the remaining brown bears live, again, from what I understand. So apparently the Ussuri brown bear can approach the size of a Kodiak bear, which is by some measurements considered the largest bear in the world. Although I've heard also that polar bears sometimes are considered the largest. So anyways, either way, they're absolutely huge. If you're familiar with grizzly bears in the States, they apparently can get even bigger than that, or at least they're of equivalent size. Generally speaking, Hokkaido bears eat a vegetarian diet. They will eat fish and some types of bugs and things like that as well. But generally speaking, they just eat fruits and nuts and things like that that they can forage from the forest. However, as you'll soon find out in this story, which was an extreme case, they have been known to attack and kill human beings with a fair amount of frequency, actually. Around the time that this event happened in 1915, as I said, in winter, there were a lot of Japanese settlers moving to Hokkaido. Actually, I believe you see a huge uptick from like the 1890s up until the 1910s, 1920s. I read a statistic that during the first half of the 20th century, so from 1900 to 1950, during which this story takes place, 141 people in Hokkaido were killed by Ussuri brown bears. And even today, if you visit the Shiratoko area, where there are a high number of these bears, they will make you go through it's like a mandatory bear safety course. You have to watch a video. It's pretty silly, but they make you go through that before they even let you walk within the park, because that's how potentially dangerous they can be. And I've shown you a few pictures. You can definitely agree with me that they are fearsome, they are terrifyingly big, and very clearly they have the strength and power to do some serious damage to anyone who crosses them. Another really interesting thing, actually, I'm talking a little too much about these bears. I get kind of geeked on them because they're just really, really cool. They're like majestic, huge, awesome bears. But apparently they're cousins, so like they have, they're very closely related to brown bears in Siberia, in Russia. So it's not exactly the same bear, but essentially the same thing genetically. They often get into conflict with Siberian tigers, actually. And Siberian tigers will prey on these bears, as crazy as that sounds. Generally, they go for the smaller bears, like young cubs, or female bears, or sick bears, things like that. But there are some really interesting statistics that have been taken about these encounters. So out of the 100 or so, or maybe 200 or so recorded instances of a Siberian tiger attacking, or vice versa, I guess could sometimes happen, one of these brown bears in Siberia, just over a third of cases where one or the other of the two species was killed in the encounter, the bear actually came out on top, which is pretty badass. I mean, tigers are apex predators, and keep in mind, the tigers, as I mentioned before, they're usually attacking the weaker, non-mature bears. So even out of those encounters upon weaker bears, the bears come out on top a third of the time or more. I think we can all safely say that would be a pretty crazy battle to watch. I think that's enough of a preface for now. Let's get on to the incident itself. So our story begins in November of 1915 in a small village known as Sankebetsu Brown, which is about 11 kilometers inland from the west coast of Hokkaido. It is now uninhabited. You could probably guess why. But at the time it was a very small village. So as you can imagine, during this time, encounters with wildlife were not uncommon. There weren't that many settlers, particularly in this area. So, the locals were used to seeing wild animals and bears, I would imagine, quite frequently. But nevertheless, one day, a bear came into the village, and the locals heard one of the horses in the village start to panic. And they went to go see what was happening, and the bear had already fled. And apparently this time the bear only took corn that they'd harvested. So he took a sack of corn or something like that. About a week later, the bear showed its face in the village again. And once more, the horse was spooked, and the head of one of the families in the village started to get worried about the safety of the horse. Apparently they only had like one horse in the village. That's how small it was at the time, and they couldn't really afford to lose that horse or for the horse to be in any sort of danger. So some of the locals conferred, and they decided that they would hunt the bear and try to kill it so that this wouldn't happen again in the future. So fast forward then again to about 10 days later. Now we're at the very end of November, and the bear came back, and one of the local men shot the bear but failed to kill it, and the bear ran off. Some of the locals tracked it out into the forest. They found blood stains, but apparently the snow was falling so heavily. There was a big snowstorm that night, and so they had to call off the search and go back to the village. Now, they thought that this would deter the bear from coming back to the village again in the future. I mean, after all, it was just shot, and it knew by this point that humans were not to be trifled with, or at least that was the logic at the time. It has to be said as well that this whole encounter was a little bit unusual, because by this time, Hokkaido, if you've ever been there, is completely covered with snow. By the end of November, you can't even move around really. I mean, everyone's pretty much snowed in, especially during this time when they lived in just small, isolated, cut-off villages. So having a bear coming in looking for food that late in the season was a bit odd. And looking back on it, analyzing what happened and speculating, I think most people have come to the conclusion that the bear suddenly just woke up for whatever reason from its hibernation and started behaving a bit erratically. So now fast forward again to December 9th. So about 10 days later, the bear once again reappeared in the village. Apparently the wound wasn't a mortal one and the bear was still alive. The bear apparently went to the house of an Ota family. Their name was Ota. And at the time, the only people home were a young woman and her baby. So basically a farmer's wife and their child. Now, things start off pretty horrible. Apparently, she saw the bear enter the house, and she tried to fight it off, but the bear bit the baby in the head and killed it, and then dragged the mother away off into the forest. And accounts by villagers who came to the scene after the fact say that it was a pretty grisly scene. Apparently it looked like a slaughterhouse. There was blood and bits and pieces all over the place. So the very next morning, on December 10th, a search party of 30 men was apparently gathered. So a pretty sizable party against one bear. And they went out to recover the remains of this young woman. Her name was Mayu. They had only just entered the forest. They were about 150 meters in when they spotted the bear right there. So apparently it hadn't gone very far. The men shot at it, but again, they failed to kill it. Apparently they just wounded it again. And these bears are huge, so they can withstand, quite a beating and a lot of punishment. I mean, they can take several bullets without being killed. I don't know what kind of caliber these men were using, but it was weaponry of the time, so not quite what we have today. After the bear fled, they looked around under some fir trees and they were able to recover Mayu's remains. Apparently only some bits of her remained, like her head and a couple of other things. So pretty crazy stuff, pretty graphic. After this incident in the morning, a lot of the villagers, I guess based on previous experience with these bears, they deduced that the bear was stashing or hiding Mayu's remains in an attempt to preserve them for later consumption. So they were convinced that now that the bear had a taste for human flesh, that it would be back. And so they went back to the village and they gathered at the Ota house where the previous attack had taken place, armed to the teeth, ready for this bear to come back. And sure enough, it did. Although they were posted at the house and they were ready for the bear's return, they still freaked out when the bear got there. And they shot at it, but again, maybe only one person hit it by accounts from the time. And the bear took off again downstream into the forest. There was apparently like a guard posted of quite a few people, like 50 men at a nearby house, but by the time they got there, the bear was already gone. So they gave chase after that. So I just want to take a second to try to unpack why the villagers would have panicked, even after anticipating the bear's return, gathering a sizable group of men together, and having, firearms handy at the time. Well, the bear was later measured, and I don't want to spoil the ending, but they were able to measure the bear at the end of the story, and apparently it weighed 750 pounds and was almost 9 feet tall. So this bear was intimidating to say the least. And it had, just eaten one of the local villagers. So, all these people who were in the hunting party, they had seen her remains, they'd seen the aftermath of the bear's first attack. So they were obviously, shaken, and you can't really blame them for that. So as if the story weren't already really crazy, it gets a lot crazier. So as all the guardsmen and, the men from the previous search party take off downstream in pursuit of this bear, all of the local women and children, out of fear, they decided to congregate at another family's house, the Mioke house, which was presumably not too far away, maybe on the other side of the village. So at the house, only one of the men stayed back as sort of a bodyguard for the women and children at the house. And that was unfortunate because this bear, apparently like the smartest bear that's ever lived, circled back, eluding its pursuers and going back to the village, and as luck would have it, to this very house where everyone was congregating. Another local woman at the time was cooking a late dinner, and she was in the kitchen. She had a pot on the stove, and she was carrying one of her little children on her back. And another one of her kids apparently was also in the room as well, when she suddenly heard a noise, like a rustling outside. She panicked, thinking it was the bear, and rightly so. And in the ensuing chaos, apparently she doused the fire with the contents of the cooking pot, and one of the lamps fell and broke. So the whole house was plunged into darkness. So she tried to flee when this happened. She tried to get away from the bear, but the bear was able to basically attack her, knock her to the ground, and bite the head of her young son on her back. Then, after all the commotion, the remaining guard, his name was Odo, he came rushing in, and upon hearing that, the bear released the young boy and charged Odo. The bear quickly got the better of Odo, mauled him in the back, and then turned its attention to several of the other young boys that were apparently in the room as well. And the bear immediately killed, by mauling, 2 of the young boys and injured another young boy after a little bit of a struggle. Now, again, things get pretty horrific, if they haven't already, but at this point, the bear then realized that there was another woman nearby who was pregnant. She was the wife of one of the men who'd gone off after the bear. The bear attacked her immediately, and she was killed and eaten, basically on the spot, apparently. I mean, it's just crazy to imagine that a brown bear would behave in this way. It's very unusual, but anyways, later accounts by villagers report that they could hear this young mother begging for the bear not to bite her stomach, but to bite her head instead. So she was willing to sacrifice herself to save her baby. But unfortunately, later, although the fetus was found alive, it died shortly thereafter. So, after all of this happened, I mean, it must have just been like, it must have been one of the most horrifying scenes you can imagine at this house already. And at this point, or around this point, the men who were off supposedly chasing the bear realized that they were not actually in pursuit of this bear. Like they had lost its trail. They didn't know where it was. So the men decided to circle back themselves, and pretty quickly they made it back to the village. At which point the original woman, her name was Yayo, who had the kid on her back who was bitten and the other kid clutching at her heels. She related the news to them because she had escaped. And at that point, I mean, everyone was so desperate and they were so afraid of this bear that a couple of the men actually proposed just setting the house on fire and burning the whole thing down to kill the bear, just assuming there were no survivors left at that point. But Yayo, the woman, she forbade it because she didn't want there to be any chance that anyone still alive in the house would die in the fire. So at that point, the men got together and they came up with a game plan. They decided to split into 2 groups. One group would go to the back of the house and one group would go to the front. The group at the back of the house would make a commotion to scare the bear out the front door, at which point the men would open fire on the bear. Okay. So the plan was working great. They made noise at the back of the house. The bear came out the front door, but in the general chaos of things, one man was standing in the line of fire of the other rows of men who were supposed to all open fire on this bear. So they were not able to shoot for fear of killing this man in front of them, and the man who was blocking their way, his gun misfired, as luck would have it, right? I mean, how could this situation get any worse? Okay, so after the gun misfired, the bear was able to bolt off into the darkness and was out of sight. So for the rest of that day, they weren't able to find the bear. I mean, it was already evening. And the survivors all gathered at a local school. There were several seriously injured people from the attack. And in just those 2 days, in just that 2-day stretch, 6 people were already dead, including the one pregnant woman. So pretty horrifying stuff. They say, and I don't know how true this is, but they say that after that incident, the second day, the only men who remained to guard the village were veterans of the aforementioned Russo-Japanese War. So basically only the hardiest of men had the balls basically to stay there after what had happened. And I mean, again, can you really blame them? I mean, this bear appeared to be supernatural. Like I mean, you know, that's one of the things that really turned me on to this story, was just how fantastical the whole thing seems. It's like, how could one bear, you know, manage to inflict so much damage? But this isn't even nearly the end of the story. So before we move on to the next day, I have to talk about a couple of things that were happening meanwhile. A man named Saito Ishiguro, who was the husband of the slain pregnant woman, was not aware of what had happened to his family, but he broke off before the return to the village, and he went to file a complaint or a report with a local police office in a neighboring town. And it was too late to return, so he stayed in a hotel in that neighboring town after filing the complaint. Another man who was in the village during the time of the attack, or at the time of the attack, he knew about this kind of... There was a well-known hunter that lived in another nearby town, and he went to seek his aid. He got to the man's house and explained what had happened, and at this point, the man recalled a story of a similar bear, or a bear that matched the description of this bear that had killed 3 people previously in a different village. This hunter, or as we'll soon learn, retired hunter, named this bear as Kesagake, which apparently means like diagonal slash from the shoulder. So this bear had already been named. It was a kind of a minor legend at this point, because of the fact that it had killed these 3 women in a different village. And so, kind of excited, the man who'd come seeking his help, you know, begged him to come and help them hunt the bear. But by that point, apparently, this retired hunter had pawned off his rifle to pay for alcohol. He was, you know, he decided just to drink himself to death, basically, at that point, after what he'd seen. So he refused to help. The next day, these 2 men, the one who went to enlist the hunter's help, and also Saito Ishiguro, whose wife had been killed, whose pregnant wife had been killed, they returned to the village, and they pieced together everything that had happened, and they formed a guard for that night. Luckily, though, that evening went by without incident. The bear never returned. Okay, so this was December 11th. Okay, so skip to the next day, December 12th. By this point, word of the attack and everything that had transpired had reached a main government office. It was the Hokkaido government office. And they decided to form a sniper team, okay? So they meant business. They were gonna take care of this bear once and for all. So they assemble a team of snipers. They all make it to, they made their way to the Mioke house where the huge attack from 2 days prior had taken place, to sort of assess the situation and come up with another game plan. The plan they came up with was based on the premise that the bear would most likely come back to the scene of the previous attack to retrieve the bodies of those that it had killed, okay? But by that point, they'd already moved all the bodies out of the house. So a very controversial plan was proposed by one of the members to lure the bear back into the house with the corpse of one of its victims. Apparently this was condemned by most people in the party, but eventually, for a lack of, you know, a better idea, they decided to go with it. They waited in the house, the sniper team, and they had a corpse placed in the house, and sure enough, the bear did return that evening. However, the bear sensed that something was wrong, something was a little bit off, and it took off back into the forest before anyone could actually shoot the bear, or that it could retrieve this bait that they left in the house. So at dawn the next day, this is now December 13th, the group of men, the sniper group, and then the remainder of the previous search party, so now numbering about, they were now about 60 men strong, they decided to patrol the village, and they found that the previous night, while the bear was on its way out, it had ransacked the old Ota house, so the house that the first attack took place in. And the bears had stolen a bunch of rice and winter food and all this stuff. So at this point, the men said, okay, well, we have to get rid of this bear at all costs. So we have a lot of men now. We can cover a large area of land. Let's fan out into the surrounding forest and see if we can't find this thing. Okay. But several of the members started realizing, or I guess understanding the weight of the situation and how desperate things had become. Because at this point, the bear very clearly, had gone way off its rocker and was probably not going to be very cautious in the future. For the time being, they decided that night they would post a line of guards and snipers on an ice bridge that apparently they had made. I don't really know what that means, but they made an ice bridge, and they created a formation of men along it to watch out for the bear that night, to basically post guard. And later in the evening, there was one incident. They saw a shadow approaching. They thought maybe it was a man, so they called out to it. There was no response, so the leader of the guards ordered everyone to open fire. Apparently it was the bear, but whether or not they hit the bear, no one really knows. But the shadow took off into the forest again, and they were still, yet again, unable to kill this damn thing. So at some point, the hunter, whose help they had failed to enlist a few days prior, decided actually he was going to join the hunt and help them track down and kill this bear. His name was Yamamoto. So the next morning, everyone decided to go out to the opposite shore of the stream to see if they could pick up any signs of kesagake, as they called this bear. And they were apparently able to find some tracks of blood in the snow, which seemed to suggest that maybe they'd hit the bear again the previous night when they opened fire on that shadow. So a couple of the best men for the job, I guess, so Yamamoto and one more man, the two of them, they decided to head out alone because Yamamoto was already familiar with Kesagake's kind of behavior patterns, having had experience with this bear before. So everyone figured, that he was the best man for the job. So he brought one other man with him. They went out into the forest, and sure enough, he was able to track down the bear very quickly. They found Kesagake, the bear, actually resting underneath a tree, kind of nursing his wounds. He was kind of in bad shape. I mean, understandably, because he'd been shot at least 3 times over the course of the last few days. And Yamamoto took 2 shots at him and hit him once in the heart, and then once, I believe, in the head after that, killing the bear instantly. Later, they did kind of like a necropsy of the bear, and they were able to find parts of the other villagers in the bear's stomach, just as if the story wasn't gross enough as it is. So anyways, despite all the horror and the cleverness of the bear, him constantly giving everyone the slip, finally Kesagake was dead. So yeah, that's pretty much the tale. In total, 7 of the villagers died after the baby who was on Yayo's back died of his wounds actually a couple years later, they say, after the attack. So in total, the death toll was 7 villagers. So yeah, pretty wild stuff. The majority of the deaths took place in the first couple of days, but the story just kept getting crazier with all the repeat encounters with the bear, all the wounds it sustained while still living, which I find pretty crazy, all the ways it outsmarted the villagers time and time again. It's I don't know, I mean, it's one of those stories like you couldn't really make it up to be any crazier, any more fantastical than it already was, you know? The village soon became deserted, actually. The villagers left pretty quickly after that, they say, although I didn't get any more specific details about how long it took. But yeah, apparently the locals just didn't really want to live in that place anymore, and I can understand that. Must have seemed cursed after what happened. And apparently one of the kids who was present during the attack, he was the son of, I think, the mayor of the town or something like that. He was 7 years old when the attack went down. Years later, he became an avid hunter, and he vowed to kill as many Ussuri brown bears as he could. And I think his final kill count was 102 bears by the end of his life. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can understand his desire for revenge, but that also makes me sad because I just know how awesome those bears are and what they're capable of. And in some weird way, this story almost makes them more magnificent and worthy of protection, just based on how smart the bear was. And I don't know, you know, I get sentimental about amazing animals vanishing from the earth. But anyways, that's an interesting little story, how he just got revenge on all the remaining bears that he could find. And also, we wouldn't even know a lot of these details about the story if it weren't for one man. His name was, what was his name? Kimura Moritake. Apparently he worked for a forest office, forestry office somewhere in Hokkaido, and he made it kind of his mission to record as many details or preserve as many details of the incident as he could. So he went around, he tracked down all the remaining survivors from the village who were reluctant to speak about the incident, just because it was so gruesome. And then he also tracked down other secondhand accounts and things like that. But this was in the 60s, the early 60s, so it was, you know, after a lot of those people had already died. But apparently he was able to fill in a lot of the gaps and give us the story that we know today. Now, I mean, of course that means that some of it could be a little bit embellished. I'm sure some of it is, but I mean, even if half of it was made up, it would still be a crazy story. So what can we learn from this? I mean, first of all, I think it just really gives us an appreciation for the power and, I mean, yeah, just the sheer power of these creatures. I mean, you heard the accounts. I mean, on that one day when the bear killed, what was it, 5 people? I mean, the bear went on a rampage and just was running rampant through the house, killing people left and right with sometimes a single stroke. I mean, if that's not a powerful animal, I don't know what is, you know? So, I mean, it certainly gave me more of an appreciation for the strength of these bears, but also the intelligence of these bears too. I mean, talk about a clever animal. Sure, this particular bear was obviously exceptional, but the ways in which he was able to just, yeah, I mean, leave these people in the dust intellectually. He was able to always be one step ahead of everyone in the village, and sometimes I would argue 2 steps ahead. I mean, it just shows you that animals are capable of a lot more than we often give them credit for. So that's another thing that I think we can learn from it. And I think finally for me, I think it just goes to show that, you know, just like humans, you know, you can generalize about groups of people or people in general, and we do this more with animals than we do humans, but we generalize about a certain animal, like, oh, they're really docile, they're well behaved, or, you know, sharks don't want to eat people. They just, you know, they're just tasting when they attack people, or it's by mistake. They mistake you for something else, right? And we always make these broad sweeping statements. And don't get me wrong, I'm, you know, I'm all for that. I think that we should try to refrain from vilifying animals as often as possible and just give them the benefit of the doubt. And I think these bears, these Ussuri brown bears, are no exception to that. However, I think it just goes to show you that just like humans, there's going to be the oddball, example that is the exception to the rule and just goes crazy and exhibits excessive, gratuitous behavior like this bear did. I mean, in humans, you see it with serial killers or, crazy perverted people or, people who deviate so much that it becomes sickening to us, or they obviously are a danger and a liability to everything and everyone around them. And this bear was no different than that, I feel like. Just like humans have serial killers, these brown bears have examples like this bear, who, just have a thirst for blood and who develop a taste for human flesh, and who not only, I could see a bear occasionally opportunistically attacking a human because they're starving or something, but this bear seemed to really just relish killing more and more people, like more than it even needed to eat to survive the winter. So yeah, I think it just goes to show you can't really generalize about anything, and animals are capable of crazy stuff too, but we shouldn't judge the entire species based on this one bear's behavior. That's a big thing, I think, definitely. Now, the last thing is just, again, I want to touch on, I mentioned it earlier, but why did this happen? And there's some speculation. I think the majority of people who've analyzed this, the general consensus seems to be that it was something to do with hibernation, because the bear should have been in hibernation. There's this thing called false hibernation, where the bear, or like failed hibernation rather, where the bear will wake up suddenly from hibernation and then they can't hibernate again, so then they're just like loose out in the winter where there's not a lot of food, so they get really desperate and they do things like that. Or maybe the bear just never hibernated in the first place, couldn't find a place to stay, so that was one example, or one explanation rather. Another thing is that, at the time, as I've shown earlier, there were a lot of people moving to Hokkaido, and a lot of deforestation was happening and reduction of habitat, and these bears were probably kind of pushed off to the sides, and they didn't really have anywhere else to turn. So that was probably a contributing factor as well, I would imagine, in this particular case. And then, yeah, just the last thing I would say is my argument that this was just a bear that was a little bit nuts, just a little bit crazy in the head. So yeah, whatever the reason may be, I mean, you see examples of this sort of thing around the world from time to time. You have the lions that the movie The Ghost in the Darkness was based off of, who just ate like 50 people or something crazy like that. You've got man-eating tigers in India right now, and you can see some overlap there in what has driven the tigers to do that in modern times in India, with what drove this bear potentially to do what it did. But yeah, I think you see this across the world from time to time, and they're rare cases, but they happen nevertheless. But anyways, I hope you found that interesting. I'm always looking for new ideas of things to cover, related to the outdoors, but also just related to Japan in general. So if you've got any extra suggestions, please leave them in the comments, and hopefully you'll like and subscribe to the channel as well, so I can keep doing stuff like this. And by the way, I recommend you check out the forestry workers record of this case of the Sankebetsu Bear Incident. His book was called, well, it's a reprint of his account, and it's called The Devil's Valley, or Dokoku no Tani. Dokoku no Tani. Check that out for sure. Also, if you ever get a chance, I recommend you go to Hokkaido. Hokkaido's awesome. You can see these bears firsthand. Maybe not the one, which, by the way, there are no remaining parts of that bear. Originally there was a skull and some fur, but I guess they got rid of it. But anyways, yeah, go to Hokkaido. It's awesome. It's beautiful. You can hike volcanoes. You can go to the forest, and hopefully you can get a glimpse of one of these magnificent bears. So anyways, until next time.